Hi everybody, welcome back to Civil War Monitors Behind the Lines. I'm your host, David Thompson. Today I'll be joined by Dr. Nicholas Marshall, who is an Associate Professor of History at Marist College and the recent author of The Great Exaggeration, Death and the Civil War, which has recently come out in the March issue of the Journal of the Civil War Era as a full-length article, as well as a more abbreviated piece in the New York Times Disunion blog. So, Dr. Marshall, thanks so much for joining us today.
Thanks for having me.
I wondered if you could perhaps start off by just giving us a bit of a broad overview of kind of the general line of argument that you have going with your piece.
Sure. It really is it came out of this sense that we're all using these statistics to describe the Civil War. So anybody who's teaching it or anybody who talks about it, and I do this too in my class, which is to start out talking about the volume of death and how significant that was. And the statistics that are used are very interesting. Usually it is that the total number of deaths is more than all other wars combined in United States history, which tries to give you some sense of how large it is. And then a comparison to say, okay, if we look at the percentage of the population that was killed then, which was about 2%, and we extrapolate to the numbers today, then what we would experience if we experienced a civil war would be something on the order of 6.5 to 7.5 million deaths, which is a huge number that we couldn't even contemplate in some way in this context. When we think back of the Iraq War deaths and the responses that were coming up there when we reached 2,000 or 3,000. So this is just the goal of these numbers, I think, was to provide perspective for people, to say, look, this is an event that we can't really comprehend. And here are some statistics that'll help us comprehend it. But my research is really focused on the context of the antebellum period and through diaries and letters. And that led me to start to doubt these statistics, the usefulness of the statistics, because they didn't take into account the context of the culture and the actual numbers of death in the antebellum period. And so that's when I started really saying, let's take a look at this. And of course, there are a number of books that have come out relatively recently that have spoken to this directly. And that actually encouraged me to really start looking at the numbers and trying to come up with an article like this. And in the end, I think if I were going to really try to summarize what I'm doing, the argument, it would be the amount of suffering and death in the antebellum period was so great, and actually continuing into the postbellum period, that the war was not so much a fundamental change, but actually was in line with the amount of death and suffering that was going on before. And that's the problem with saying that is that people then think that I'm trying to somehow minimize the importance of the war. And we'll talk about that in a few minutes, I think. But my basic point is that once you put it in context, this looks like variations within the norm, actually, of the period. And what I really wanted to do was see if there was that people at the time experienced this volume of death in the same way that we are projecting back upon them. And in the end, I don't find much evidence for differences between the Civil War era and the period before. And there's been a lot of work done that has shown how the continuity over the periods was really important. So really what I'm saying is we need to stop using these statistics because they're misleading. The war is significant for many, many reasons. Perhaps the most important event in American history. But the volume of death itself is not a good argument for that. And so that's just what I'm trying to get people to rethink that.
Okay. Now, as you've kind of indicated here and speaking, that there's been a little bit of pushback, perhaps, to, I would say, certainly the New York Times piece, the Disunion piece, but But the article itself, I think people are talking about it in the Civil War community if they've had a chance to read it, which is obviously a bit longer than the New York Times piece. And I wondered if you just wanted to comment on that. And again, you did reference the fact that a lot of people, I think, are, I guess their criticism of you would be that you're trivializing the war, is essentially, and the deaths associated with it is the criticism. So I wonder if you just want to comment just a bit further on that.
Yeah, I think that's an entirely misplaced criticism. But it makes sense given how people are so attached to the significance of the war, that many people will process it that way. So when I first came up with this and sent it out to a few people, there were very mixed reactions. Some people had that negative response, well, you're trivializing it, or you're saying that death doesn't matter to people, or any number of other things. And then other people were responding, oh, this is really great. You've really made me rethink something and put this into a different context. And I should have known that this was going to happen. I'm a little naive, I think. But if you're familiar with Mark Neely's book about the limits of destruction, where he took on some of these issues, this is, going back now 7 or 8 years, he was talking about the destructiveness of the war and how that had become such a central component of the way people were interpreting the war. And part of his approach was to question the statistics, but another part was to describe the context of the Mexican War, the battles with the Native Americans, and to show that the actual conflict wasn't as brutal as people were somehow describing it. But I was most impressed with was the violent reaction against his interpretation. James McPherson wrote a pretty scathing review of it, and it's come up over and over again whenever anything is mentioned about deaths in the Civil War. Well, Mark Neely is wrong. And I think that's really unfair because his was a much more subtle argument about this. But then Drew Gilpin-Faust's book came out, and there was this really interesting moment because her book was published almost simultaneously with Mark Shantz's book called Awaiting the Heavenly Country about death before the Civil War. And I took those two books to be absolutely in contradiction to each other. Frequently people reviewed them at the same time and did not comment on this. But what Shantz did was reveal that there was an incredible culture of death before the war. And what he argues in his introduction is, well, the Civil War was massive and these deaths were incredible, but we have to recognize that that was in some way made easier by the fact that there was so much concern, focus on death in the pre-Civil War era. He even says it made it more likely for people to kill and be killed. I'm not sure if that's the case, but that would seem to be in direct contradiction to Drew Gilpin-Faust, who was saying that this is a fundamental shift in the way the country operates because of the volume of death. And she puts those statistics right at the beginning of her book. And so my work is really focused on antebellum attachment or problems with death. And so when I read her book, I thought, she's right. There is this focus on death in the Civil War, but it's not fundamentally new. So I think my perspective was, we need to respond to this in some way. And so when I started working on this piece, and just a few years ago, David Hacker's piece came out in Civil War history, which created another whole reaction to just the numbers. I don't know if you recall, but the editor of when they first published that called it, I just want to make sure I get this right, that this article stands among the most consequential pieces ever to appear in this journal's pages. And what he did was take a statistical view of the deaths and try to figure out how many people had died in that cohort. And he didn't make any claims about how significant the war was. He was just trying to say how many people died. But raising the number from, say, 625 to 750 was, according to the editors, one of the most consequential pieces ever published, which I found to be just over the top. Okay, the numbers have gone up some, but what is the significance and meaning of them? You can't just simply say that 750 means something entirely different than 625 and say that this is the most consequential piece. So that was the context, and I think when I say something in opposition to that, because people loved his article. They loved it because it made the war even more brutal and more consequential based on the total numbers of deaths. And James McPherson, when he wrote the little intro to it, he took another shot at Mark Neely there, saying, well, this also demonstrates why Mark Neely is wrong. And I just think that's misplaced. He wasn't arguing that. And that's also not what I'm arguing as well. And that's why I think you get this pushback. If there's a perception that you're diminishing the sacrifice of individual soldiers and the significance of the war. And I'm definitely not doing that. One of the significant parts of the article is to show that before the Civil War, people were traumatized by death. And so it's not that death is, that the Civil War makes life cheap and people are just passing it off, and that death by disease is just something to just accept. Because people were emotionally involved with their relatives and loved ones in ways in the 19th century that they weren't before. And this was trauma for them before the war, and it was trauma during the war. So each death is suffered in much the same way that it was before. It's a loss. It's a tremendous loss. And yet, people would perceive those deaths differently because they were working in a very different demographic environment. It's not that the deaths are passed off, but they're understood in a way. And in some ways, it's like high infant mortality rates, right? Where when we talk about those in the 19th century or all the way through into the 20th century, people really start saying that, people accepted it. They knew that there was a high chance or high probability that that the children would die. So it's not that you don't feel loss, but you do experience it as something that is relatively normal as opposed to something new, different, and overwhelming. So I think that's really what happened. People misread what I'm trying to say there and think that it's a critique of the significance of the war or even of the sacrifice of the individual soldiers. I just listened to the interview that you did with Michael Adams about his book, which is great. It's wonderful, and all those things are true from my perspective, right? The war was horrible. The experience for the individual soldier was terrible. And yet, that's not an argument about the volume of death. That's a discussion about the soldiers' experience themselves. So I don't think these are in contradiction, although some people would argue that they are. But I think that's a mistake.
I wonder if we could just continue on that thread just a little bit longer. I wonder if you could share perhaps a bit of the raw evidence that you're drawing off of that is really indicating to some of these Civil War contemporaries that wartime deaths were being viewed relatively in the same light as antebellum deaths.
Well, the first thing I do is I try to show the high volume and the response to death by people in the antebellum period. And I have a number of diaries. This is really my research. So this is it's overwhelming, right? In some ways, exactly how Drew Gilpin Faust described death in the Civil War, I felt about death when I was reading antebellum diaries and letters. So there's a huge volume of evidence about that. And anybody who looks at the period recognizes that death is a central part of the culture. So that's one part. Okay, then if we get into the Civil War, though, we have to recognize, and this is a part that I brought up in the blog that people really reacted negatively to, and that is the question of 2/3 of these deaths being caused by disease and how people would respond to those. And, of course, it's disease that's killing all these people before the Civil War. Oh, can I just add a footnote that people did die? It wasn't just infant mortality, but there was high probability of dying in youth and in middle age. In the article, I mentioned that you only have a 47% chance to live to age 49 as of 1850. So it's not that it's just infant mortality, then people are going to live forever. It's everybody's dying. And you see this when you look at the diary evidence. So what other evidence is going to be useful to make this case? Diary evidence from during the Civil War, where people are back at home and they're talking about deaths in their community. And I mentioned a couple of these in the article as well, where there always are a few people who died from the community in the Civil War, and yet they're mentioned in this context of, okay, 2 of them died at this battle, and yet 15 other people died this year as well that we buried in the cemetery. So it's recognized, people are understanding that death is problematic, and yet it's in this other context. So there are Civil War diaries that make that clear. And then there's this lack of discussion about the volume of death in the sources from the period. So if you look at newspapers, it's just not there. People talk about individual deaths. They mention the level of casualties of various engagements, and these are significant and important, and yet they never say, wow, this is overwhelming, something new and different that we cannot handle. And Lincoln's experience is another great one, I think, for this, and I talk about that in the article as well. Of course, he had two of his sons die, right? One of them during the Civil War. So his whole family was aware of this, and they had experienced this whole thing beforehand. But if you look at his papers, he writes very moving letters to individual families whose children have died in the war. He's concerned about death. He recognizes how important it is. But he never talks about the total volume. The only place I could find where he does is in his address to Congress in 1864. And it's a really interesting take because he says basically it's not an issue. We have more men now than we ever had, and we can continue this fight forever. We're not exhausted. There's no hope for us stopping this based on somehow that we're losing men. And then if you look at the Democratic resistance in some way, it's really more about constitutional issues than it is about the volume of death. You would think that if this volume were overwhelming, that would be a great issue that they could use against the Republicans. And it's just not there. It's mentioned that, and as the casualties build up in engagements, it's going to be told, what is this for? Is this useless? But as soon as the Union starts succeeding in late 64, those arguments just disappear. So it's not the deaths that are important to them, it's whether the war is being won. So I think if you look at all these things, and I haven't mentioned the fact that people are going to interpret death in a different way, which I think is another important point. But that's the evidence, I think, which suggests that this is much more of a continuous problem than it is something new and dramatically different.
Yeah. Now, I wonder, when you were looking through all these different sources, if you saw, is it really the case that there really isn't that much of a difference between reactions to, say, a wartime death at Antietam, Vicksburg, versus civilians that are dying at home, or civilians that, I don't know if you came across this in your source material, civilians that fell victim to violence from the armies, and that was the reason that they died?
Yeah, I think, no. I think there's a very similar reaction to any death, right, because it is a loss. And usually the reactions that we find are by family members. But the context is very different. It's funny, I was just listening to the radio the other day, and it was an interview with an Afghan who had just joined the Afghan army. And they were asking him why he did it. And he said he did it for his country, to defend his country. And he also said, and if I die, this is a glorious death, to have died for my country. And I think that's another part that we have to recognize. When people die in the war, whether they are dying from disease or on the battlefield, the response is that this is a really valuable death in some way. It might be even easier to take than having your son die at home from tuberculosis, which was common. So in some ways, and Frances Clark in her recent book, War Stories, I don't know if you've seen that, it's a wonderful, wonderful account of how people were responding to the circumstances at the time, how the culture responded. And she sees this continuity as well. But those deaths were interpreted as a glorious sacrifice, and oftentimes, and Mark Shantz describes this too, as a direct passageway to heaven. So instead of having to demonstrate that you have been saved, you are demonstrating it in another way. And so that death is somehow easier to take. And because of the context. Now, it's hard to find evidence on how people are interpreting a soldier's death from disease as opposed to death on the battlefield at home. There's just not a lot. It's difficult to get at that. But I don't think it would be very much different. You're still dying for the cause. And yet, the death from disease would, I think, be understood not so much as being caused by the war as being a part of that continuous problem that has come before and which is going to go on later on. So it's an interesting, I do think that people have to be careful about conflating the deaths by disease with the deaths on the battlefield in the way people would view them at the time. Because so many people were dying from disease, the recognition that it was caused by terrible conditions in the camp would not be there. And I'm not arguing that the camp didn't produce more deaths. Those conditions were terrible. And people did die from disease in those camps, in part because of the terrible sanitation and all those things. And yet, we have to, my question is not what caused it, but how would people interpret it? And so, once again, we're in a place where we have to say, okay, what do we have to show that would make the case that this is so overwhelming and different? And usually historians who do that end up talking about the statistics instead of materials, sources from the period.
I wonder if we could switch gears just a little bit. When you're looking at the article length piece, Cornelius Smith and her diary forms a central kind of tenet in your piece. And I wondered, it's a powerful story. I'm sure reading the entire diary is, but the sketch that you're giving us is really quite something in terms of what she endured in the antebellum period. And I wondered if you could just kind of comment a little bit on why you decided that would be, kind of one of the big sources, because it's not, a quote or two in a paragraph. It goes on for quite a while. Yeah.
It's an interesting question about how you make how you provide evidence for your point, right? And so how do you do that? Do you have a bunch of short diary entries that could show that people suffered, that a family member was lost? I also tried to show that some of the diarists kept records, and that was what was so amazing about the antebellum period, is that they kept records of people who died in their neighborhood, and the numbers were just huge. And you see it over and over again, way beyond what we would experience today. But her diary was especially interesting because it was so complete and it covered so many years. Most of the diaries from the period covered a short period of time. There were lost, there were pages missing, people kept diaries for weather purposes. A lot of times they don't talk about the significance of death. They may have lists of the number of people who died and say that they had gone here and there to get the body prepared, or any number of ways. But hers is just fuller. It's a better description all the way around. I would argue she's representative of what the experience was for everybody else, but she had a better description of it. So my reason why I chose her is because it's so overwhelming, right? When you read her account, and it's year after year, and more of her family member dies, children, young adults, parents, accidents, this whole just incredible list over time, I think is the most effective way to try and say, what, there was something going on before the Civil War that we have to take into account. And if you look at the numbers, there was about a civil war and a half number of deaths every year. And, in the country leading up to the Civil War, 650, 700, 750,000. And if you think about those statistics that are thrown around today, the 7 million dying from the war, we have only about 2.5 million people who die every year in this country, and it's pretty consistent. So it would be nothing like what they had at the time to say, to argue that we're experiencing 7 million deaths every year. We're just not. So it once again, it gets us away from the apt comparison of how people were experiencing things at the time.
Now, finally, Dr. Marshall, I'll let you go on this question, just in case you want to really hammer it home here. What is kind of your end goal here with this piece, do you think, if you could try and articulate it once more to our viewers here and to the larger public?
I just think it is to make the case for the war on valid grounds, right? In some ways, it's just the death part is significant, and yet it is not the reason why the war is important. And so I guess I just want people to think about it in those terms, and to rethink the way that we introduce the whole story. Because I think Mark Neely is fundamentally right. There has been a shift over the last 20, 30 years to talk about the brutality And the deaths have become this, I don't want to say cult, but it is a central part of how we all understand the war. And I would just like to see us, de-emphasize that a little bit, because I don't think it was experienced by people at the time the same way that we are projecting those feelings back upon them.
Okay. Well, fair enough, Dr. Marshall. Thanks so much for joining us. Again, it's The Great Exaggeration, Death in the Civil War. It's in the March issue of the Journal of the Civil War Era, as well as a truncated version on the New York Times Disunion blog. I certainly recommend everyone, if they can get access to the journal piece, to read it, because it does delve into more detail, and I think it answers perhaps some questions for people after they've read just the New York Times disunion piece. But nevertheless, a very interesting, provocative piece. I think it's going to cause a lot of conversations, a lot of discussion amongst people who are interested in the Civil War, and I think that can only be a good thing. So, Dr. Marshall, thanks so much for coming on again. Perhaps we can have you on to discuss the larger project when the time comes.
All right. Well, you're welcome, and thank you for having me on.